Hello, you're very welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This is episode number 18, and we're going to focus on politeness today. So first of all, we're going to talk about two principal reasons, in my opinion, that people might come across as impolite in English. They might be perceived as impolite by others. We're then going to focus on some really nice structures to use when we're asking for information or making a request in English. Especially when we're speaking to someone we don't know. So, that first time kind of introduction question. And finally, we're going to focus on polite structures to use when you already know the person, but you want to be friendly or to be that extra bit professional. So let's jump in, guys. I'm often fascinated by this. Why some people seem impolite or less polite when they're speaking in English. So as foreigners, for example, in Ireland, I meet a lot of people from abroad, and some sound more polite when they're speaking in English, and others sound less polite. So I find that very interesting because I think in general, as a nation or as a population, Irish people are quite welcoming. People will always ask you how you are, where you're from, how you're doing, what you're visiting, etc. So generally speaking, I think we're quite welcoming overall. Now, there is a minority, as there is in every country, sadly, that are not so nice to foreigners. But look, forget about them, just avoid them. That's a sad reality of life. But we're here to focus on polite language to use to nice people, or when we're speaking to nice people. So why do some people sound rude? Well, in my mind, I think there are two reasons that people might seem rude in English, and we will arrive at those two reasons. But before we do, a little explanation. I also think there's something else happening here. Someone might seem rude when they're using English as a second language, but often native speakers won't tell someone if they find them rude, which is strange, right? It is strange, because really we should give them feedback. I think it's just the way that we deliver feedback in the English-speaking world. There's lots of layers to feedback and lots of layers of politeness. And maybe it's overlooked sometimes that in communication, it's really important to say to someone whose second language is English, hey, that sentence in that email, it sounds a little bit aggressive. Or it just simply doesn't sound very nice. The use of the English language often has a lot of ways to avoid placing blame or to be polite in even the most trying or difficult times. But the two things that cause impoliteness, in my opinion, are tone and structure. So if we start with an example of tone, if someone says, hey, where's the bank? That tone doesn't fill me full of joy, It doesn't sound very nice to me. It also sounds like there's some kind of false sense of confidence between the speaker and the recipient of the question. If you don't know the person, there isn't that confidence, and hence that kind of direct speech. It's just a little bit abrasive. The level of formality is just not correct. It could be interference from that person's native language that they ask or request or ask questions in a monotonous tone, okay? But in English, we would expect variation. So you might ask in a different way, hey, where's the bank? Okay, it's a little bit friendlier, okay? It's a little bit better. But still, if you're asking that question to a 70-year-old person and you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, it might just seem a little bit informal. We should greet people or speak to people with a little bit of respect, obviously. So tone is really important. Okay, so the second sounds better than the abrasive first example, but still we could improve, no? And we can improve by focusing on structure. Structure is interesting because often in other languages there's a polite form of the pronoun you. So when we're dealing with someone in other languages, we can be direct because the structure and the form allow us to be relatively direct, but we're using a polite form of you. I'm thinking of Spanish and Italian, etc. here. In English, we don't have that structure. In English, the funny thing or the joke is that the question just gets longer and longer in order to be polite. It might be something like this. Excuse me, I was wondering if you might be able to tell me where the bank is. So that structure, it gets quite long, no? It does. And that's just the reality of English. And it can be frustrating sometimes. But really, if we have some kind of set structures that we use, it's not such an issue. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple of examples here, from a tourist perspective if they were visiting Ireland. So let's check some out. Excuse me, do you know where I can get a nice pint of Guinness around here? Sorry to bother you, could I ask if you know where the nearest ATM is? Sorry to disturb you, would you know by chance where the tourist information office is? Sorry there, excuse me, do you have any idea if there's a pub nearby with good live music? Excuse me, I was wondering if there's anywhere nice to eat around here? Excuse me, could you tell me if I'm headed in the right direction? I'm trying to reach the beach. I think I might be lost. Alright guys, so those are some nice examples of structures that you can use when you're trying to initiate a conversation or just request some information. But in Ireland, you'll probably make a friend if you ask them a question like this. You might end up with the drinking buddy for the week. However, for the last part of the session, I want to focus on, those situations where you are already in confidence with someone or you know someone quite well through work and you want to ask them for information, about a project you're working on, about a deadline or clarification about something. Maybe there was a miscommunication via email, someone didn't understand what the deadline is or a clause in a contract wasn't clear, etc., etc., etc. This is kind of an interesting one because you already know the person. So we're using the past tense or the past continuous to add a layer of politeness and to remove an abrasive, direct structure. So if you say to someone, "Do you have a minute? I need to speak to you." The tone is important here, obviously. If it's a very polite tone, no one's going to have a problem with you using direct speech. But if you want to buffer or create that extra layer of politeness, we're being super polite and respectful here. You might use, "Jack, I was hoping to speak to you about this project. I was looking for some guidance." Okay, so we're using the past continuous to kind of add that layer of politeness. Or, "Sorry to bother you, Rachel. I was wondering if we could have a word. I'm really confused about the deadline for the project." Another example, "Hi Michael, how are things? I hope the family's keeping well. I was hoping to sit down and hash out a few details regarding the contract." So to hash out means to discuss the details of the contract or details in general. So those are kind of the key structures or polite structures, that past continuous. "I was hoping to have a word. I was hoping to steal a minute of your time. I was wondering if we could discuss X, Y, Z, etc." Those are the two kind of past continuous structures that we use to introduce our need to speak to that person and to get a minute of their time. So guys, those are the two main things I wanted to speak about today, essentially. The use of good tone in your conversation. Delivery is so important, and it's an easy thing to practice. You can get a transcript or simply read along with an audio like this. You can speak along with the track and replicate a tone, etc. Sometimes tone is all that is needed. A kind tone, a kind word at the right moment, and structure is that second layer. If you don't have the vocabulary to express yourself using indirect structures, then simply use a nice tone. Like, "I'm really sorry to bother you, but would you have a minute just to talk about this project?" Tone goes a long way, 90% of the way, coupled with good body language. And structure is it's the cherry on the cake. If you can deliver a nice structure, that past tense structure is a very nice way to deliver it because you make it less direct and it seems more polite. With the absence of a polite you form in English, this is just a reality. Those kinds of indirect structures really do work. It gives a better impression of the person who's speaking. You're demonstrating really good English skills, but not just that, you're demonstrating really good communication skills in English. Those longer structures, a lot of people know them, but they don't really delve into them or practice them as much as they should. If you have a lesson with the teacher, maybe just say, "Today I want to talk to you as if you're 15 years older than me." Okay? I want to talk to you in a very respectful way throughout this conversation in order to practice this structure or these structures. You might have clients who are that age, 15, 20 years older than you. So, that would be the target of one session, or that could be the target of many sessions. Anyway, guys, that's all I wanted to discuss in today's session. I'm going to attach a link to one of my favorite websites, which I share with a lot of my students. It's called Test English. Look, I'm not getting any money off them, but it's fantastic. There's a particularly nice section on using these structures, the past tense for politeness, plus a lot more. So I'm going to share that here as well. I recommend checking it out. It's for C1 level language learners, but if it's a little bit too advanced for you, Google polite structures in English and you'll find plenty of pages to practice, or use ChatGPT or whatever your preferred platform is. And you could always listen to this podcast again because, we recommend repetition. So give it another listen if you'd like. And guys, have a fantastic week. Take care of yourselves. Ciao. Ciao.